טוב, אז מי היה פה בבוקר? אז אני רק רוצה להגיד לכם שאני לא באמת אומרת 200. זה מבוטל, לא חייבים היום. אני גם לא אומרת אבו יויו, זה בוטל עוד לפני. אני כן לוקחת את הילדים למעיינות, פקל קפה והכל. אני בקושי מגיעה לאזור הים, אבל חיה בהשוואה תיאורטית מתמדת לאזור החוף, כמו בתנ"ך. תנ"ך זה ירושלמי? אין, אני ירושלמית, נו. מה יש להגיד? זה כתוב לי במרשם האוכלוסין. מצד שני, כשירמיהו אמר, והיה באחרית הימים, נכון יהיה הר בית השם בראש הערים, ונישא מגבעות, ונהרו אליו כל גויים. הוא התכוון לקריית מנחם? או לא? הוא בטח התכוון לעיר העתיקה. גויים נוהרים לשם כל הזמן, אבל אם לא להיות מקובע, אז גם לרחוב יפו, בטח למלון המלך דוד, תחנה מרכזית, בית הכרם. בית הכרם זה ירושלמי? טוב, מקסימום בית הכרם. חנוק, לא קריית מנחם. אבל היי, אני גרה מספיק קרוב לירמיהו כדי להתפרנס באופן יומיומי מחלומות של אחרים על גאולה. נכון, כבר אמרנו, זה תלוי ברכבת הקלה, והיא לא כל כך קלה, היא די כבדה למעשה, אבל אומרים שיום אחד היא תגיע לשכונה, וינהרו אליה כל גויים, או לפחות אלה שמתפרנסים מהם, שזה פחות או יותר כולם פה. יש פה ירושלמים שלא סוחרים בקדושה? קבצי נדבות? משרד החוץ? כותבי מאמרים על קרמיקה ארמנית? הירושלמית, האסלית, שאומרת 200, למרות שהיא בכלל מטורקיה, והאשתנו רוקולו פיתה עיראקית, והאבן הירושלמית שהיא בנויה באיזה מיקס רומי ממלוכי ובאו-האוס, זה בסדר, גם אני בכלל מפתח תקווה. וג'קי לוי הוא מבת ים. למי אכפת? כל עוד אני כאן איתכם, סוחרת בקדושה, מייצרת קצת תרבות ירושלמית חינם. זאת אומרת, לא חינם. בתקציבי ממשלה. שגם היא, כמו כולנו, סוחרת בקדושה, ואנחנו, הירושלמים, נהנים. אגב, יולי-אוגוסט זה הזמן לקחת את הילדים למתחם התחנה, עושים שם פסטיבל בינלאומי. מה יותר ירושלמי מלנפוש בפסטיבל חינמי ולהרגיש שזה מגיע לנו בדין? אתם רציתם את ירושלים תרבותית? אנחנו הסכמנו להיות הניצבים? הסכמנו להיות החומר האנושי שידגים את המטאפורה באופן יומיומי, עדכני, אז לפחות שיהיה חינם. בכלל, מה יותר ירושלמי מחינם? אהבת חינם, שנאת חינם. חינם נמכרתם ולא בכסף תיגאלו, לא בכסף, בתמיכות ממשלתיות. או קרנות בינלאומיות, רק לא מקומיות, כי כבר הסכמנו, אין מקום כזה. מקסימום מקום מפגש. הם הדרך של התרבויות, ומסביבה שכונות לוויין, שכונות קצה, מחוברות אל המרכז כמו כפר דרוזי, אבל ירושלמיות, במידה שמזינות את החלום. באמצעות הרכבת הקלה, כמה חבל טוב, מה יותר ירושלמי מבעיות תחבורה בעיר שלא חוברה לה מעולם. אז בקיצור, אני ירושלמית, ושיקפצו כולם. שמעת ירמיהו? שיקפצו כולם. לפה. אנחנו בדיוק מארגנים כנס, משהו בינלאומי. אנחנו נעשה את זה על נבואותיו של ירמיהו בנאומיו של מרטין לותר קינג. וגם על קרמיקה ארמנית. זה יהיה בחינם אגב. חינם לגמרי. תודה רבה.
שוב שלום. מעניין כמה כסף אפשר לקחת עם המילה ירושלים, כל פעם היה שקל פה נאסף כשהיא נאמרת על הבמה בהקשר הזה. אז ברוכים הבאים למושב השני, שעוסק בעצם ממשיך את המושב הראשון ועוסק בהתפתחות הפיזית של ירושלים וצמיחתה למיתוס ולסמל ולמיתוס. I'm switching to English. I'm glad and honored to invite Professor William Peel, Schneiderwin, a professor of biblical studies and Northwest Semitic languages at the University of UCLA. Bill is a good friend of Israel. He's been here so many times. It's written here. And he's also the author of 6 books. The last of them, The Finger of the Scribe, How Scribes Learn to Write the Bible. So he has a lot to say about biblical studies. And his lecture today is on Jerusalem Scribal community of practice and the centralization of religious myth and Persian period. Bill, thank you very much for joining and coming here. כן, אפשר.
Seems like we're going a little late, so I'm going to try to shorten this a little bit if I can. First of all, I'd like to thank Yuval and Ben-Czvi for the invitation to speak today. And I'd like to slightly change the title of my talk here. I want to talk about making Jerusalem sacred again, and I changed the title so you can see where I'm going to go. Briefly, I want to talk about the nature of the Hebrew scribal community in Jerusalem during the Persian period, which would have been relatively small and priestly. And second, I want to add some reflections on the gap between Jerusalem as symbol and reality that Oded Lippschitz has talked about. I think there's a need to make Jerusalem sacred again after the Babylonian destruction when the temple gets rebuilt. Now, one key for making Jerusalem sacred will be redefining the term hamakom, the place, which served as an interpretive trigger for several texts and traditions. The Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem must have created a crisis for the priestly community and the temple. By any account, the Jerusalem temple was destroyed, and this had to be a theological crisis. Where did God live now? Exilic and early post-exilic writings try to answer this question. For example, Isaiah 66, Hashemayim kis'i, right? The heavens are my throne, and the heavens are the throne of God, and the entire earth is his footstool. God no longer dwells in the temple. There is no sort of place that humans can build for such a God. Or to put it differently, what's the point of a temple if God was present with his people throughout the diaspora? And the issue comes to a head in the apparent reluctance to rebuild the Jerusalem temple that is illustrated in the book of Haggai. The people say, lo et bo, right? Lahiwanot. Namely, there's no urgency to rebuild the temple. After all, we didn't have one. We don't really need one. So Haggai and Zerubbabel must cajole and force the returnees to rebuild the Jerusalem temple. What's their reluctance? The destruction of the Jerusalem temple had to have forced the people to reimagine its role in Judean religion. But this position couldn't have been popular with the Jerusalem priestly community during the Persian period. The priestly community in Jerusalem had to take pains to make the temple sacred again by reorienting old traditions and relocating them in the Jerusalem temple. Let's begin with a review of what I would call the scribal community of practice in Jerusalem. When I was writing my recent book, The Finger of the Scribe, it became clear to me that scribal pedagogy, namely apprentice learning, was not fully appreciated in the literature. Scribes learn through apprenticeships. And so I borrowed an anthropological term, community of practice, from seminal research by Jean Lave and Etienne Wagner on apprenticeship learning. This type of learning creates long-lasting, close-knit, small social networks. And when we examine the archaeological and epigraphic record of Persian Yehud, it becomes clear that there would have been only one but significant Hebrew scribal community of practice, namely a community centered around the Jerusalem temple, a priestly community using Hebrew to preserve and embellish earlier texts. And we can estimate the size of this scribal community by looking at the archaeology of Persian Yehud itself, and specifically Jerusalem. And here I turn to the insights that are continuing to emerge from the Gavati excavations led by Yuval Gadot and Yeftash Shalev. It's now clear that the core of Persian Jerusalem had shifted along the Central Valley, but while there's continuity, there's no major public buildings. It's difficult to imagine this Jerusalem as much more than 1,000 people, maybe 200 adult males. And how many of these people are writing in Hebrew? Maybe a couple dozen. And for what purpose? We have to imagine a relatively small and enclosed group. In this model, the extent and diversity of Persian Hebrew literature would have been created by time and not by a large number of competing and different scribal communities of practice. Persian Yehud could sustain only one Hebrew scribal community. They were affiliated with the Jerusalem temple, and they collected and preserved and developed traditions about Jerusalem. So let's look at these guys. I want to take a look at the geography and the problem of forgetting a geography of Persian Jerusalem. We have very little of the geographic terminology known from the Deuteronomistic history maps onto the geography of Jerusalem described in Nehemiah. One illustration is the famous midnight ride of Nehemiah we have right here in Nehemiah 2. It gives an account of the inspection of the ruins of Jerusalem, but none of the places are clear. For my purposes today, the term that I'm especially interested in is Ein HaTanin, or sometimes translated as the dragon's spring. In the standard biblical lexicon, the primary meaning for tanin is sea monster or sea dragon, but it can also refer to a serpent or a crocodile. For me, sea monster or dragon makes the most sense because it's part of a myth that is being created about Jerusalem. Unfortunately, Nehemiah's ride is the only place in the Hebrew Bible that mentions this dragon's spring. And the main spring we know about in Jerusalem is the Gihon, or if we accept Ronnie Reich's interpretation, the whole Canaanite water system that's related to the Gihon. In any case, Nehemiah seems to be alluding to the Gihon, perhaps at both its source and its later exit near the Siloam pool. But why doesn't Nehemiah mention the Gihon? Why does he call it the dragon's spring? The term Gihon was no longer used for the spring or the water system by the Persian period, and knowledge about the location of the Gihon in the Persian period seems fuzzy at best and probably was actually lost. And this continues. For example, Josephus doesn't mention the Gihon in his descriptions of the geography. And when we go to later 19th century explorers, it continues to be a mystery. For example, Charles Wilson in this 1865 map of Jerusalem locates the upper Gihon in the Mamilla and a lower Gihon further south in the Hinnom Valley. On the right side of the map, he labels the Gihon as the Virgin's Well. But the idea of dragons continued. This is illustrated in the story of the discovery of the Siloam tunnel inscription by the 19th century explorer Conrad Schick. Schick explained that the discovery in his initial publication, one of my pupils, when climbing down the southern side of the tunnel, discovered some marks like letters on the wall of the rock. And the student was Jacob Spafford, and his sister Bertha Spafford Vester eventually wrote about this in her book, An American Family in Jerusalem. She writes that Jacob was interested in archaeology, and the year after we came to Jerusalem, he discovered the Siloam inscription. His imagination was fired by learning about the subterranean tunnel in the Ophel Hill that had been excavated by King Hezekiah to bring water inside the threatened city. And she writes, it was supposed to have been haunted by a dragon. This seems to be an allusion to the dragon spring in Nehemiah. The tradition of a dragon spring must allude to the primordial waters of creation that flowed under Jerusalem and its temple. The Tanin lived in the Tehom, in the primordial abyss. In Genesis 21:21, the priestly source tells us that God created the Hatanin Hagedolim, the great sea monsters. And I would point to texts like Isaiah 27, Isaiah 57 that refer to God's conquest of the sea, where God punishes Leviathan and kills the Tannin in the sea. Texts like Ezekiel 47 includes a vision of a new temple that has the idea of primordial waters flowing out from under the temple that are fitting for the rivers of Eden. Of course, the term Gihon is well known as one of the three rivers emanating from the Garden of Eden, and I would suggest that the identification of Jerusalem with the Garden of Eden has its roots among the priestly scribes of the Persian period. They draw upon the mention of the Gihon in Genesis 2, and you see its development in an allusion to the dragon's spring as well as in the primordial waters in Ezekiel's temple. Since the Gihon in Genesis 2 is part of an older J source, the Persian scribal community would be using older texts and traditions and investing them with new meaning related to Jerusalem. The most well-known example of Persian development of the Jerusalem temple is the connection of Mount Moriah with Jerusalem. In Solomon's account of the building of the temple in 1 Kings 6, there is no connection made with Mount Moriah. But in the rewriting of the temple in First Chronicles 22, there's an expansion that's explicitly introduces Mount Moriah. Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David at a place that David had prepared. I think it's important to highlight some of the wording here. Asher Hekin Bikom David, right, at the place that David prepared. The place, the makom, alludes to the story in Genesis 22 itself, where Abraham goes to a place. Vayelech el hamakom, right? The makom becomes Jerusalem, at least according to the Persian priestly community. The reference to the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusites recalls another major transformation in the book of Chronicles, namely David's census. There are a number of subtle changes and embellishments in the rewriting of David's census. To begin with, 2 Samuel 24 has an important theophanic image for Jerusalem, namely the angel of the Lord wielding his sword over Jerusalem. But Chronicles, the Persian priestly writers, embellish this image and describe the angel as standing between heaven and earth with the drawn sword in his hand. At the culmination of this story, then, Chronicles rewrites the purchase of the threshing floor. Of course, the price increases. In Samuel, David purchases the threshing floor for 50 shekels of silver. In Chronicles, David has to pay 600 shekels of gold. That's quite a bit of inflation. More importantly, Chronicles introduces the language of hamakom. The replacement already begins in verse 22, where Chronicles requests from David, Tanali makom hagoren, give me the place, the threshing floor, so that I can build there. And this again has to be an allusion to the place that God would choose in Genesis 22. The Chronicles rewriting of the story concludes with David's declaration. This is the house of the Lord, or this is the house of God, and this is the altar of the burnt offering, and then that is followed by 8 chapters of description of David's preparations. Another tradition that migrates to Jerusalem is the story of Jacob's dream of a ladder with angels in Genesis 28. Now, apparently you can buy this ladder. It's about $6,500 online. But we know this story, right? The patriarch dreams of a ladder with angels ascending and descending, and he calls the name of the place the gate of heaven and the house of God. Later, rabbinic texts overlook the apparent connection with the city of David and understand it as a reference to Jerusalem. Here are just a few examples of them, and the one that's really interesting to me is the explanation that's provided by Bereshit Rabbah, which points out that the ladder stood above the temple site, while the top of its slope was over Bethel. That is to say, the ladder was on a slope, right, with its foot in Jerusalem and its slope above Bethel, and that way the ladder could be in 2 places at one time. The migration of the ladder of Jacob tradition to Jerusalem, however, can be traced back much earlier. For example, the old Slavonic ladder of Jacob text was apparently a Greek translation of a Second Temple Aramaic or Hebrew text. It begins by observing that Jacob found a place, and he had a dream there. And he saw a ladder extending from earth to heaven, and the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And then the story recalls the Akedah in Genesis 22 when it sets the scene with God calling to Yaakov, 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 and Yaakov responds, Haneni Adonai, right? Just like Abraham before in Genesis 22. Now, interestingly enough, the Slavonic ladder of Jacob tradition does not mention Bethel, but rather cryptically says that Jacob called the name of that place the house of God. Now, this can be explained by looking at the Septuagint. In Genesis 28:19, the Septuagint omits the place name Bethel. It's worth looking at the broader context to appreciate what the Septuagint has done here. In verse 17, it translates, "This is none other than the house of God." That is the oikos theou, which is a perfect translation of Beit Elohim. However, in verse 19, the Hebrew has Beit El. But the Septuagint still translates it as oikos theou, house of God. Now that's possible, but a really forced reading of the Hebrew, and it's clearly trying to shift our vision. And if you want to understand that, all you have to do is look at the other examples, 57 examples, where in the Hebrew we find Beit El simply transliterated into Greek. This is the only time that the Septuagint is going to translate Beit El as oikos theou, house of God. Okay, so this Septuagint translation must refer to an older, probably Persian relocation of this text. I'm going to skip this other example to sort of fills it in. There's also a really nice example of this that's developed in the temple scroll, where the house of Jacob seems, the covenant with Jacob seems to refer to the house of God and relocating it to Jerusalem as well. But I'll skip on to my conclusions here. I'd like to conclude with an observation about the semantic transformation of the Hebrew term makom, or place. One commonality in the relocation of the text I've discussed is the resignification of hamakom as Jerusalem. It's well known that hamakom becomes a metaphor for later Jewish texts, in later Jewish texts for God himself. How does this happen? God begins to become identified with his place of residence during the Persian period. This is undoubtedly an interpretive move fostered by the priestly scribal community in Jerusalem. They identify God's name with the Jerusalem temple. I believe this interpretation goes back to an old Deuteronomic expression where God repeatedly promises to put his name in Jerusalem. This expression can be traced back to Deuteronomy 12, which reflects on the place that God will choose, hamakom asher yivchar. The Deuteronomistic history develops this idea at length, and we find a variety of expressions reflecting this idea, particularly in the Book of Kings. Deuteronomic name theology can be traced to Near Eastern antecedents. For example, the Amarna letters reflect this concept. In tablet 287, we read, "As the king has placed his name in Jerusalem forever, he cannot abandon it, the land of Jerusalem." Essentially, putting your name somewhere claimed ownership, but not necessarily physical presence. But this idea is completely transformed in later priestly interpretation. The key to getting God back into his temple, and indeed perhaps the key to encouraging the rebuilding of the temple itself, was equating God with his name. God just doesn't own the temple. His name there indicates his physical presence there. This hypostasis of the name, that is, making it into the material reality of God in the temple, meant that the name itself was increasingly sacred and therefore replaced by other terms. The beginning of these replacements was the use of the term Elohim for the tetragrammaton. Note, for example, in the book of Chronicles, it uses the expression Beit Elohim, house of God, 33 times for the Jerusalem temple, whereas in the Deuteronomistic history, we find the term Beit Adonai, the house of the Lord. It becomes natural then for the Persian priestly scribes to read the house of God in Jacob's dream in Genesis 28:17 as referring to Jerusalem. Likewise, Hamakom, the place, comes to refer only to Jerusalem. These are just a few examples of how the Persian priestly scribes help relocate myths and invest the Jerusalem temple and thereby made the temple sacred again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.